Live. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Christiana Ellis,
And I'm Mike Mateen.
and tonight we are talking about movies. This is another in our long running series, Watching 100 Movies, where we're watching through the AFI's top 100 films. And there's some weird nuance about it's like American films, but like some of them are dubiously American films, and then there are other ones that seem like they would be on the list but are not, and it's unclear.
And then there are movies like E.T.
Well, it's funny. We'll talk. Yeah, I mean,
I'm just teasing.
so we are going to talk tonight about. We've been working our way through the list from 100 down to one, but we are now talking tonight about number 24, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial, and then after that we'll be talking about number 23, The Grapes of Wrath. But first things first, let's start with E.T. Before we get started, I'm hearing a little bit of like a rumbling from your audio. Is there like a fan or something blowing on the mic?
Probably. I think I can turn it off. Is that good?
Yes, that helps.
That would be
I certainly understand if you need it on, but yeah, all right, we're good.
No, I can work without it.
Good deal. So let's talk about E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Now, those of us or those who are longtime fans of this show may have heard us once or twice make some comments about ET, but do you want to explain your comment? However facetious it may be, whatever percentage of facetiousness you intended.
Yeah, I mean, I'll preface it with I get why this movie is on here. I get the craft. I get its place in movie history. I understand, and I understand some of the nostalgia with it. I understand that for some people, the emotional part really resonated with them. And I think that's probably where most of my problem is that for me, it seems overly sappy almost, like to the point where it's like kind of frustrating. Like it's almost like a Lifetime movie.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-oh, somebody's at my door.
Oh no.
Better not be the drywall people. Let me run down there real quick. I apologize.
Okay.
I'm in trouble. We have to go away.
Sure, that's all right. So, if you're watching us either now or during live or later, these things happen sometimes. It's one of the charming intimacies of live streaming and podcasting that you get this little window and insight into the personal lives of your favorite content creators. I will, perhaps. It's not generously if I'm being generous to myself in suggesting that we're some of your favorite content creators, right? But that I am perhaps presuming there. But the point is that, sometimes these things happen. You gotta go get the door. Also, I've been following secondhand the labors of Hercules that Mike's been going through with construction contractors at his house there. So there's a whole thing about drywall contractor was supposed to have been there several hours ago. It was obvious that they were going to be late, so he told them not to come at all. And so the hope now is that the wondering is like, okay, did they just show up anyway? In which case, I'm not sure exactly how that's. Presumably, we'll cross whatever bridge we must when we come to it. But in the meantime, we're.
All right.
Oh, I hear a return. Was it the drywall people?
Yes.
Okay.
I said, "Is now still okay?" And I said, "You're supposed to be here about 4. It's almost 6.
Yeah.
They're like, "Yeah, we figured we might need to reschedule." I just don't understand why they didn't just call.
Yeah.
And
Well,
for anyone who doesn't know, my house is also 3 stories. Like it's like a condo, so I have to run all the way down and then all the way back up.
well,
You have to do it too.
so
All right.
so to jump on to where you left off, is my own take on ET. Yeah, I think we will find that, like very often we're more or less on the same page here. You
Yeah.
know, there's always a difference of degree sometimes, but we very rarely have strong disagreements about, you know, the the placement of a movie. With ET, I remember watching it as a kid and just loving it.
Right, and that's why I was kind of hinting about the nostalgia part. Is that
Yeah.
there a lot of kids who watched it in that era, like it was really important
Hmm.
for them. Yeah,
But then when it came out on its home video release in like 2002, and that was like its DVD release, I think. And it was the first time a lot of people had seen it in a long while. And I remember watching it then as a, you know, young adult, you know, early 20s, and saying, ugh, this is way more sappy and contrived and emotionally manipulative than I remembered, and I kind of remembered really being very unhappy with it. And I suspected, as I planned to revisit it for this process, that I would find my opinion about it, seeing it a third time, would come somewhere in the middle, and I was pretty much exactly right, which is to say that the things that I didn't like the last time I saw it, I still didn't like, but I was able to separate those things enough that I was able to enjoy much of the movie, even if I roll my eyes at some parts of it.
right. And I think you know your journey was a little bit different in that you were very high on it, then very low on it, and then you kind of settled
Well,
somewhere in the
I was
middle.
high on it as an 8-year-old.
Right, right, right.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
understand, but I want to go back to my 8-year-old self too to kind of talk about it because I think it's sort of where we came from. Also, is where we arrived at where we did, and that I never loved it as an 8-year-old, but I also didn't have the capacity to know that a movie could like not be good. Like I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
know that that was a thing. Like, and I wouldn't have been able to know that I didn't like it because it was super contrived or anything like that. I just remember not being as enthusiastic about it as
Oh,
your friends of
we
mine
lost you
and
a little bit there.
others.
You
Are you
remember
muted?
not being as enthusiastic. That's where we. Yeah.
As a lot of my friends and peers at the time, I watched it with them, and but I just I don't I I do remember that, and then when it came out, it just seemed so silly, and then I started to formulate like, oh, this must have been why I didn't like it. Like it's just not that good, and then it became more of like a joke to me, and so this time watching it, I tried to go in with an open mind, but I knew what I thought of the movie and it delivered exactly what I thought it was going to deliver.
Hmm.
So it remains more. So for me, it's more of like exactly how I opened the podcast. Like it's just kind of more funny for me to make jokes about how like this movie is considered
Yeah,
so
yeah.
good because of all these
Well,
reasons. But it's not actually that good, and so I've actually really been more level on it. I just didn't know back then
hmm,
how to express that. When I
yeah.
was
Well, without wanting to like nobody has, you know, there's no movie that produces like a totally universal reaction in anyone, right? You know, it's not a pun about the studio here, but in any event, I revisited Roger
like,
Ebert's. Yeah, I revisited Roger Ebert's great movies review of this movie, and he does something that's pretty atypical for him, which is to write the review in like an alternate format where he's writing it like he's writing a letter to his 6-year-old nephew about how much they loved it when they got to see it.
hmm, I don't remember that.
Like during the remaster. Well, this is remaster from the review from 2002. I don't, why would you remember that? I don't know.
You
I
do?
only remembered it because I read it like an hour ago.
Ah,
So I read it because I looked it up. Anyway,
got it. Okay, got it. I
I
thought it
looked
had
up.
I thought it had resonated with you for 17 years. So
No, no. So Roger Ebert, when he was still around, did a column where, you know, he would write about great movies, and he, you know, talked about a lot of those, and most of the movies on this list were written about in that column, and so it's kind of just a touchstone. He was always one of my favorite film critics, but the fact that he wrote this review in that way, I think, is really telling, because ultimately what it comes down to, and this is the defense, such as it is, to what both of us are reacting to, I think, is this is a kid's movie. It is for kids. It is filmed from a kid's perspective. The camera is almost always like at a kid's eye level looking up at things. It is for kids, which is not to say that kids' movies cannot be equally entertaining to adults or that all kids will like it. But I think in some respects we have to bear that in mind when we
Yeah.
hold higher standards of dramatic and narrative theory against some of the stuff that it's doing. But at the same time,
Fair
yeah,
enough. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, you're right. It's good to check ourselves on that and remember
yeah,
that it is a kids movie. I would say some of the best kids movies are ones that have, a movie like The Incredibles would be a great example that kind of traverses all generations, where it's exciting for a little kid from the superhero family, but it's very cleverly funny for the adult.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
and
I respect that talent to cross. You know,
right. And then the other concession, and I'm making all of these up front just because I suspect a lot of the criticisms on this movie we're going to share. So we're certainly going to talk about those. But putting it all in a context, right? The other thing to keep in mind is that there is no question that this movie was crazy influential. It did ridiculously well at the box office. I think adjusted for, like period of time that it was out, it's still like a number 4 financial grossing movie of all time or something like that. I didn't look up the actual details, but it's something like that. And so it did ridiculously well. It's crazy influential. So by that measure, it perhaps deserves to be this high on the list, if only through that. But part of what that means, and this is something we've discussed in some of the other movies, is that when a movie becomes so influential that it becomes just this touchstone where you feel like you've seen the movie even if you haven't, just because you've seen it parodied and ripped off and riffed on so many times, that sometimes that can actually start to rob the original a little bit of some of the impact of some things is not as powerful because we've seen 1,000 versions of it in other movies.
right? It's almost also like like maybe the quote from it's in Jurassic Park. I think it was an Asimov quote or something like that, but about standing on the shoulders of geniuses. Like that's a legit thing. Like you take the initial genius, but then people make it get better
Yeah.
because of the bedrock of it. Like Pulp Fiction is another movie I think is that suffers from a lot of that too.
Mm-hmm.
In that, yes, what it did was groundbreaking at the time. The way that it paced the story, the dialogue, the gratuitous violence tied with humor and in a black but yet funny and uplifting way. People have done that model now better, but only because he put it there.
Right. Yeah. They were able to iterate on the new formula that he put into the world.
Right. And so you could say, oh, I've watched that 1,000 times and it was done way better than Pulp Fiction. Well, yeah, because they learned from Pulp Fiction or they learned from E.T.
Mm-hmm.
and they said, okay, I see the greatness in this, but I see the flaws and I see the next iteration and I see how I can make this even better. And that's a totally legit way for things to progress. I mean, that's how most things progress.
Right.
But you're right. It makes the original pale a little bit because it becomes not as good because someone or many others have done better. Not even just the volume of seeing it. It's that the actual talent gets better because they use this as their bedrock.
Yeah. Or at the very least, there's a potential for that, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And so, when I rewatched this movie for this podcast, one of the thoughts that really struck me was I can only imagine watching that scene where the bicycle flies for the first time and not knowing that was about to happen. Imagine the impact of that scene when you don't know that that's what's about to happen. Like, that would have had to be breathtaking.
Even though they put it in the poster?
Well,
I'm
yeah,
kidding.
it's a valid question, but, At the
Well, you
same
wouldn't
time.
have, you wouldn't have known that it was coming like that.
Yeah.
Like the poster doesn't really explain why the bicycle
Well, yeah,
flies.
you don't necessarily know in advance that it's meant to be literal. I don't know actually if it was in the trailer, but
Yeah, I mean, we won't know that. I mean, yeah, again, that's part of my problem with this movie is like, I just, that's kind of the mindset I get into is to make those like snarky jokes about
yeah.
it,
No,
like
and no, that's totally fair. I don't want to rob you of that. But I think what we're both
but I
sort
feel like
of
I'm not being fair to the movie because that's just sort of where I enter when I watch this. Like, I
yeah,
want to
well,
be kind of smart ass about it, you know? Like,
yeah. I mean, I think both pieces of that are good to talk about, right? On the one hand, it is your genuine and sincere reaction to the movie, which is part of what this show is all about.
right,
But it's also good for all of us to be able to self reflect a little bit on where we come from when we watch a movie, right? That's part of what's great, I think, about talking about movies like this is that you get a broader context for whatever opinion you have.
right,
And I think what we're both reflecting on here is that E.T., like a tea bag, has become so steeped into the American cultural consciousness over the decades that sometimes it's a little hard to remember exactly where the boundaries are, right?
right.
But in any event, is there anyone out there listening who has not seen E.T.? Maybe. But even if you haven't, I bet you know what it's about. You know,
Yeah. It, it's not that complex of a story as you talked
no,
about. I mean,
yeah, it's
yeah.
definitely not. Little alien gets accidentally left behind, befriends a little kid who feels like an outsider himself. They form sort of a friendship, and then later they have to help the little alien get to go home.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the all the kids who see the world more purely rally behind the alien, whereas the adults.
Oh, I lost you again.
I go again.
Yeah. Whereas the adults
So,
is where you left off.
whereas the adults, with the exception of the immediate family, are all big bad corporate, like study the science of the alien, but told in a way that doesn't make them like cartoonishly evil either.
I want to push back against that because I think that we are set up to expect that and then find that at least with that main guy, the only guy we actually get to know at all, he is really not like that at all. I believe he is 100% sincere with his speech to Elliot about like, no, I want to help ET. I'm doing everything I can think of. But he's coming at it from an adult perspective, but not a mean, faceless, brr. Like he
Right.
is set up that way, but it's a deliberate subversion, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that I maybe painted a little harsh in the beginning because where I eventually got to, I think you'd already kind of started to interrupt me because you were trying to
Oh,
push back. Like that's what I even said. Like I said, they
sorry.
managed to do it because it is they do it in a lot of faceless way. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
most of the adults are faceless in
Yeah.
that they have a mask on or they have this. Like it's kind
Mm-hmm.
of done. But that's why I said it's not done in this cartoonishly evil way, and that's where I was going to get to is exactly what you said is that when you actually do engage the main adult, like what it turns out to be is that adults have lost the imagination or whatever to
Mm-hmm.
understand that maybe sometimes just like love or whatever the hell they're trying to get at is and just
Yeah.
caring about things is enough that maybe he's doing the right thing in his mind but he's trying to over science it
Yeah.
as opposed to just the purity of the children
Well,
and it's not
yeah.
and actually that's one of my favorite messages in this movie. I think it's one of
Mm-hmm.
the less manipulative and one of the more pure ones is that you're right, like sometimes maybe some things could be better looked at from a child's perspective
Yeah.
instead of our adult brains. And that's probably so I wanted to get that out because I want to give the movie the credit for that, just like you did.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way that it gets there is, I think the way that it paints the purity of the children love thing, like that part, I think is just a little too much for me. Like how this is just like, oh, all it takes is Elliot being connected to him, and then they like he can get fixed. Or I don't even remember exactly. I mean, I
Well,
watched it 2 nights ago, and I still barely even remember how that all like kind of works.
and the thing is, it's not that you don't remember; it's that it is incoherent within the movie. And because I thought a lot about this, I was focused on this whole plot point when I rewatched it, and I've been thinking about it since then. Although I do like that it turns out that the adults are not bad guys. They're just not seeing things from this innocent, childlike perspective, like you said. Like, I like that concept. But the problem, I think, is that when you make that turn, suddenly there's no more stakes in the movie. Where's the danger? Where's the conflict if the adults are good guys? And so now we have to introduce this idea that E.T.'s getting sick, except that, like, but he needs to get to go home at the end, so somehow he has to be okay again. So why does he get sick, and then why does he get better again? Like, there's no logic to any of that. Because it's one thing to say, they work really hard to set up that E.T. and Elliot have this empathetic connection, which leads to that bizarre sequence where Elliot's at school and he's feeling, E.T. get drunk and watch old movies and stuff like that, which is bizarre, and we'll probably talk more about that in a minute. But the whole sequence exists to show us that there is like a real link between them, like a
Right.
psychic link. And then the two of them getting sick together, like the story could hold together as long as we're saying that like E.T. is an alien, like he can't survive on Earth indefinitely. And Elliot's getting sick too because of his connection with E.T. And like that all tracks. But why does E.T. get better again? Like it's not like Elliot stopped liking him before that.
Right. And there's like this weird scene. Again, like you said, it's kind of incoherent because it's almost like and again, I don't have it frame for frame, but it's like. That's why I said, like, it is weird to me that I don't remember a movie I watched 2 nights ago. But to your point, it is pretty incoherent. But there's like the scene where he like gets better, and it almost plays like he was faking it for a little bit. Like he kind of like pops to life, and he's like, like ET's better. Like, but how did he get better so quick? And like, it was
right, it plays
he
like
wasn't faking it, but like kind of felt like his response was that he had been faking it.
Yeah.
To try to get the adults off of him or something.
Because there's nothing.
At one point.
Yeah, there's nothing that happens to trigger him getting better.
Right. It's like his own death, basically.
Yeah. It seems to react to Elliot's heartfelt speech saying goodbye, except that that's exactly the same mode that Elliot was in all along. So what changed? All the adults left the room, I guess, but why is that the answer?
Right. And that's what I said. You leave the scene feeling like E.T. faked his own death to get the adults out of the room so they could run away. And that's just a weird thing. And I know that's not what it's trying to say happened, but there's not really another explanation, especially with his response to it. But again, like that's where I come from this like snarky perspective. Like, is that literally what he just did? Did he just fake his own death so they could get away? And you almost can't argue that could be a legit telling of that.
There's a whole sequence in there that so I want to first give a lot of credit to the movie for the bit where Elliot opens the front door and there's a guy in a spacesuit there, because that's amazing. That sequence is incredible. That is just such cool imagery, and the way it all plays, I love all of that. I like the guy. So when I was doing a live tweet when I watched this, and one of my tweets here was where is this? Oh, the movie spends a lot of time establishing Keychain Man, which, as a side note, apparently in the script his name is Keys. Anyway, the movie spends a lot of time establishing Keychain Man while hiding his face all through Act 1 and 2, only to reveal him in Act 3 as some guy. Like, the movie does this big reveal up to his face, and it's just like, Oh yeah, I mean, it's a guy.
Right.
What? But so, and I really don't hate that he turns out to not be the sinister guy that we've sort of been led to suspect.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but the problem is that it just feels like this whole plot point of E.T. getting sick and then dying only to get better again. That's the part where I agree. Like, it's like the movie just doesn't trust us enough to be sad about E.T. missing his home. Like, it has to make him die, and doing it in a traumatizing way, dragging Elliot away as he screams out for his friend while E.T. is looking gross and dried out and pale and like, what? Why is that necessary? Why can't they just say he's getting sick, have someone say, "Up, it must be because he's not on his home planet. We have to get him home," and then the kids break him out? Why did we need this whole in between part where he dies and then gets better for no reason?
Yeah, that's what I said. Like,
Yeah.
you could legitimately make an argument that ET faked his own death so the
Yeah.
adults would leave, and he would help assist the breakout.
The movie certainly provides no other explanation. But yeah, it's just like this is I want to tie it all back to the idea that just from a narrative perspective, once they do the reveal that the adults are not bad, that they're not evil, they don't want to just dissect him or something like that. Or
Yeah, make it
at
real.
the very least, the guy in charge seems sincerely committed to doing everything he can to help. It's just that what he knows how to do is not this magic kid magic that turns out to apparently be the answer. Um, but the problem is the stakes all along have been, uh-oh, the bad guy grown-ups are coming and they're going to mess up everything, right? And then they
Right.
show up and they're not actually bad. And so then all of a sudden it's a matter of, oh, okay, so what are the stakes now? What's the conflict? Why is the end of the story not? And then the adults help DT go home. Like, why is that not the, like they know that they need conflict for the rest of the story, so they have to start inventing stakes. And they invent these stakes of like, oh, well, we have the radio scene where somehow ET's missing now, but why? And then they have to find him in a ditch where he looks dead already, getting eaten by a raccoon. And then they take him and they have the whole scene at the house for some reason. Why at Elliot's house? Like, why is that the secret medical facility they take him to? But okay, it's fine. I don't really care about the logistics of that. It's more a matter of the movie starts to have to invent problems so that there is conflict. And then by the time we get ET rejuvenated again, we're just back to the grown-ups being the antagonists, even if they're not bad guys. They just don't understand, right? And so we're just back at a point where we're trying to keep ET away from the grown-ups again.
Right, and I mean that's the final chase scene. Is they're the grown-ups are legitimately chasing them because they broke a presumably dead alien out of a medical facility.
Well, a house.
Yeah,
Oh,
right.
speaking of which, I
Yeah.
one of my favorite games when I was live tweeting this is commenting on how many great little weird non sequiturs that there are in this movie that like I want to they're super cheesy but I kind of love them rather than roll my eyes. Like there's one bit where it's establishing shot from outside from this suburban street looking up at their big house which has got like dozens of white vans and police cars and like tents running up to the front door and people in spacesuits and a kid rolls up on his bike and goes, "Something's happening." And I'm like, "You think?" "Something's happening." Really? Gosh.
That
How'd
is
you put it
funny.
together, Sherlock?
That is funny. Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of that, but I think like all these things we've been talking about, like you can start to see like why I know, and that's the thing. I think it bugs me. Like, why I get so snarky about this is because that's almost like become a thing now. Is to
Yeah.
just be snarky about movies,
Yeah.
especially popular ones. Like, just to hate on things that are popular. And
Hmm.
I don't like being like I don't try to be like that. But this movie just puts me in that mindset, and it's a lot of this stuff. It's a lot
Yeah.
of the like,
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
that's silly. You're just inventing problems. Like, that's that. What else are you gonna do except make a smart ass comment about it? Like,
Yeah. We're talking now about the part that I don't like very much. And that is that whole sequence where it's not even the presence of the grown-ups and or the fact that they turn out to not just be sinister. It is just that it feels like the whole plot point of him getting sick and then dying and then getting better feels like it comes out of nowhere and has no actual connection to anything else. And honestly, you could literally take that whole section out of the movie and you wouldn't notice it missing from a plot perspective.
no, you're correct.
You could just
Yeah,
say, "Oh, we did the radio scene and it worked, but it's probably going to take a while for them to get here. But we come home, oh no, all the grown-ups are there and they have ET now and we have to break him out and then get him back to where the spaceship is." You could just cut out that whole section and you would never even notice it was gone if you didn't know hadn't seen it before.
you're right. Yeah,
So, like, that's not a good storytelling sign that you can leave out the most dramatic moments in the plot in the movie. that
right. And it doesn't change the movie.
Yeah, it does, yeah, because essentially whatever actual dramatic weight it carries is just undone by, it's like telling a kid, like a kid who has a puppy and loves it, and then you go and you take the puppy and say, "Sorry, we're gonna have to take your puppy away and kill it," and the kid is traumatized, and then you give the puppy back and say, "Oh, see, we were just kidding. Don't you feel better now?" And it's like, well, yeah, better than a second ago, but
Yeah,
not
but
as good as before you
unnecessary.
said anything.
Yeah,
So in any event, yeah, I don't like that part of the story. And by token, I don't like the sequence where Elliot is at school and getting like drunk and then like stealing a kiss from random classroom girl because ET's watching the old movie. Like that stuff feels forced to me, and it feels like it's forced specifically to show us this connection so that the other part will kind of work.
yeah. And I feel like they were trying to be funny. Like,
Well,
I think
I
that's
mean, I think it's clear they were trying. It doesn't
yeah,
work for me. That scene doesn't.
yeah.
you know,
No, I agree. I found it contrived and
yeah.
goofy and not funny like on a genuine level, but funny that it even like existed. I mean, it's
Hmm. But
I,
yeah, I mean, I I think that there are big chunks of the movie where Elliot is great as played by this kid actor. First of all, rewatching it now, he's a much younger kid than I kind of vaguely remembered. I
yeah,
kind of
right.
remembered him more like 12, but where he's probably what like 9 or 10 or something, right?
Yeah, if even. Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
he yeah,
And so I
yeah.
feel like there's big chunks of the movie where he's great, but all of that stuff at school felt like you could imagine Steven Spielberg just off camera saying, "No, come on, just do it. It'll be fine. Just we have to do this so we can move on to the next scene." And I'm sure
Right.
that's not how it worked, but it's just that. Yeah, not to mention the idea that like, oh, let's have it be a funny moment that this 9-year-old is psychically compelled to grab one of his classmates against her will and kiss her.
Right.
That's I think that we have a more modern lens looking back on stuff like that and think maybe it's not great to do that.
Yes. I agree. I mean, I think it's, at the time though, it's not really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Geez, he's 11.
Well, the actor or the character?
The actor was 11. Well, 11 when it was released. So you're right. He was probably 9 to 10
Hmm.
in the filming.
Yeah.
So you were correct.
But so what I do want to do is come back around a little bit though, and say that for the scene, for all the scenes that I really don't care for, my reaction watching the movie this time was realizing that while I still, excuse me, don't like those parts of the movie, there were other parts that I found myself really compelled by. First of all, the pacing of the movie is really great, I think. Even though, there's plot points that I don't like, the movie just keeps it clicking along. Like there's a change in
Yep.
the status quo every 10 minutes or so. And it just keeps things moving in a way that you never really have time to get bored because things are progressing, and it just keeps you watching. I think it's great. I think that the kid actors, for the most part, are great, including how super cute little baby Drew Barrymore is.
Yeah.
I think that E.T. as a creation is kind of it's really interesting because you could certainly imagine an impulse to make him more obviously cute, right? And not so weird, right? Like there's still big elements of him that are, cute, but a lot of it is he's kind of what they sometimes call ugly cute, right?
Yeah.
Like I think part of his head is supposed to be modeled after like the face of a pug, like his like nose and mouth area.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
And so, like, pugs have these little smooshed faces, and I'm not saying they're not cute, but I'm saying that the way in which they are cute eschews what we would sometimes consider the criteria for being cute.
Right.
And so, in that same,
Yeah, and he makes weird noises and
yeah,
like he's well, and I think that they did design him to go again on the things that are positive. They designed him really well for the point they were trying to make
mm-hmm,
of the, you know, just because somebody's weird looking and can't and makes weird noises and can't communicate, like, okay, you translate that to like what Elliot is, a kind of an outsider himself. Like, it doesn't mean that they don't have a good heart, that they're not
mm-hmm,
good, they're not smart, they're not capable of being a great friend. Like, and they can be cute. Like, if you just kind of look at all of their, holistically.
mm-hmm,
And I think that I like that they designed him like that.
mm-hmm,
Where he is kind of ugly and kind of weird looking and kind
yeah,
of, but he's not grotesque. He's just weird,
yeah,
just like a
and
weird person would be weird.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and he's kid-sized. So
Yep.
it's that same idea of like when we see things from ET's perspective, we are seeing things from a kid's perspective, like a little kid, and it makes him something that's not an entity that is not scary, but rather something you have an impulse to want to protect and to aid.
Right.
And so even though there are bits where we do the I'm gonna do say the word classic in finger quotes, the classic gag of like oh, I found something startling, so I'm going to scream. And then the thing that I found is startled by me screaming, so it screams. And then we're screaming at each other. Ah! But the thing is, it's like,
That really fired up my dog, by the way.
oh yeah, I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
But I just mean it's one of those things where I don't think that bit was new in ET, but boy, has it been done a bajillion times now. I think perhaps even more now than since as a result of it, we're maybe it was effective in this movie when it first happened, but now I just see that bit and I'm just like, all right, can we skip ahead 15 seconds till we're not screaming?
Well, yeah, I think the only time that bit now even works is in a parody film.
Yeah.
If you
I
have it in like a,
honestly I feel like it's too played out even for that now. I
you're right. I'm probably thinking back of times where I've seen it in parody
oh yeah
film where it
yeah
was still fresh enough as a parody. But to your point, yeah, I think Yeah, it's probably even past that at this
Yeah.
point.
But at the same time, that's another example of something where it's like, are we reacting to it that way, in the right context? Is it a matter of like we've seen it 1,000 times and that's why it doesn't work? It doesn't have that same surprise shock value that it would have then. I don't know. But the other thing, one of the just bits that's really great is, it's some of the same stuff that really worked in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where Spielberg just had a knack for sort of suburban domesticity, and that was not sanitized, like messy house and kids talking over each other, and just that, the home feeling lived in with a family that feels like they've known each other for a long time, and
Yep.
just that all the verisimilitude of his depiction of suburban life feels good. What
Right.
what
That's out of the sitcom, whatever. Not that that's exactly what they were back then, but
mm-hmm,
yeah, it's that idea. Something to your point, like again, now we talk about these things like you. These aren't the only people who have done it, but you look at like what John Hughes went and did with like suburban teens, like after that, and like kind
mm-hmm,
of that, sort of raw humor side that he went down and built off of this, which in a totally unrelated vein.
mm-hmm.
Um, the idea of the outsider experiencing new things for the first time, to the point of you're like he's getting drunk and watching movies or eating Reese's Pieces, like that. While as innocent as that was in this movie, like that is now a trope. Like that's just a thing now,
Mm-hmm.
and other movies have done it. They've done it with aliens coming in, and they've done it with people going to alien planets, and they've
Yeah,
done it with animation and animals, and I mean, there's a million ways this thing has been done, and been done in a more interesting and funny way,
yeah,
and that's to what we talked about earlier. That's sort of this is a good time to sort of illustrate what we meant by that. Like it's these themes that are what he kind of took life of their own. Like again, that realistic suburban family, and I mean the, I mean, and I almost think like I wouldn't say Goonies is a better movie than this, but like some of that like kid innocent like bonding, like for me, it made more sense. It worked better in Goonies, and I
well,
know it's.
no, well,
I don't
I'm going
think it's
to
a better movie,
interrupt,
but
sorry,
yeah,
only to agree with you
yeah,
that while it's very clear that Goonies is not as influential as E.T., was certainly not as successful as E.T. in the box office sense, I do like it more.
I do too.
Yeah.
It felt it what some of what ET's trying to do with that whole kid versus adult perspective, but the adults aren't always bad.
Mm-hmm.
But it actually introduced some adults are bad. Like they at least put that into the movie,
Yeah.
to give you that real, so they're not contriving everything. But that is part of the theme of that movie is that like there's something genuinely fun about actually believing that you could find a pirate treasure and it like
Mm-hmm.
working.
Yeah.
And and that for me was more that was a better use of that thing. Like I respond to that better even now. Even as a kid I liked it better,
Mm-hmm.
and now I like it better. So again, I'm just trying to throw out some examples now that we've kind of
Oh yeah. Yeah.
covered some of the bases of what ET's
I
done well. Here are some other movies that have done that well also,
yeah. Yeah. Um, so you mentioned the Reese's Pieces thing, and I think it's interesting to talk about the product placement element just a little bit. But I definitely rewatching it, I said, "Oh boy, the whole Reese's Pieces thing is even more ridiculous than I remembered," because it is just really, really in your face of like, look here, let's put a couple of Reese's Pieces in a sort of attractively arranged little pile on a presented on a leaf, so it doesn't look quite like they're dirty on the ground, and and just and so this was not the very first movie to have a major brand product placement, but it was not super common up to this point. According to the IMDb trivia, it was one of the first times that it was like a prominent, obvious example. According to this trivia, the Donner's Superman had young Clark Kent eat Cheerios in the beginning, and it was saying that that was preceded this one, but otherwise it was like it was a whole thing. And of course, everyone kind of knows the lore about how I guess it was gonna be M&Ms, but they company that makes M&Ms thought that like they didn't want to be associated with a movie that they thought might be bad, so they said no, and then so it went to Reese's Pieces instead, and then it like quadrupled their sales or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like some of that is kind of silly, but I really found that like the whole kind of first two acts of the movie, leading up to sort of the climax of that, the radio scene before, the ET starts getting sick part. I found that I was really engaged with that, and I rolled my eyes some at the school scene with all that stuff, but not in an extreme way. It was more like in an anticipatory way, just because I realized like, oh, well, yeah, they're just setting up that we have to understand why Elliot also gets sick when ET does. It's like, we have to
Right.
make their bond literal and not just subtext.
Right. And the attempt at humor in to do it, but
Right. Yeah.
in a different time. I mean,
But again,
1982.
it's like
Humor
it
was
feels like
different.
a different
Yeah.
movie. It doesn't feel like it's part of the same story, really. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
but I enjoyed a lot of that. Like um, there's there's some good stuff in it. Like it's an extremely John Williams-y score, which of course is, I mean, it's like it is John Williams, so of course it is. But I just mean it is very on brand for him, the style
Yeah.
of music in this movie.
It's also very prominent. I think,
Yeah,
and that's sort
yeah.
of what you're also reacting to is not only do we recognize the style of music, it's not meant to be a background score. It's
Mm-hmm.
meant to be a, a part of the content,
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Another one of the hmm?
yeah, which is also part of what's on brand for
Yeah,
John Williams
yeah,
is that,
yeah.
yeah.
Most of his most memorable scores are memorable precisely because they are so music forward when they're used. Whether it's the Star Wars movies or Superman or Indiana Jones or it's like it's because the music swells in those dramatic moments, and it's a part of what we're loving as opposed to just providing ambiance. Um, another one of my little non sequiturs that I noticed was when we have the scene where he puts together the whole radio thing and they're out in the woods. And what we see on camera is a cobbled together Rube Goldberg device moving a little bit while an umbrella with a coffee can points at the sky. Cut to Elliot saying, "It's working!" And it's like, if you say so. It's moving a little bit. I guess that means it's working. Does that mean it's signaling the spaceship that is presumably in orbit or further away? I guess. I mean, it's like it's again, but it's that stuff. I love it because it is that cinematic shorthand where it doesn't have to make rational sense. It is just the movie economically communicating to us the information we need, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I like that. So I felt like rewatching it, there was a lot that I liked more than I had remembered from the previous viewing. But that stuff did not really make me like the other parts more. In fact, in some respect, it's. Um, I'm trying to remember exactly where I was, how I put it, because I was just thinking about it in the context that the movie doesn't trust us enough to like the idea of like why do we need both of them to be sick? Why do we need ET to die and then come back? It's like the movie doesn't trust us enough to be emotionally invested in wanting to help ET go home without artificially raising the stakes like that.
Right.
And that's the part that feels pandering to me.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there's, like we discussed, a lot of that.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah. But there's some great stuff like that whole sequence where the bike flies the first time, and then the chase sequence at the end. Like how great with the bit with the van driving away with that plastic tube still attached, and the guy trying desperately to climb up through it, and
kind of
Elliot
trying
kind of
to
trying to
yeah,
unhook it.
unhinge and hook
Like
it. Yeah,
yeah,
that's all
that's a
good.
great sequence. As I think Elliot's performance as the kid, his acting is probably never better than the transition between when he is genuinely distraught and the point where he starts fake crying to throw the adults off the set.
Yeah, well,
Like
that's good.
that whole progression of like genuinely sad, astounded, relieved, planning. I'm so sad. But like for deliberate effect to like throw off the adults. Like that's some quality kid acting in that whole sequence.
Yes.
Um I another sort of cheesy thing that I enjoy is how obvious the bicycle stuntmen are during that final chase sequence.
Oh yeah, when they're like in hoodies or whatever, but they turn out to be
Yeah.
like they're like 18-year-olds.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, like the guy who is supposedly Elliot in that red hoodie is easily twice the size of Henry Thomas. It's so obvious. And it's
Yeah,
just one of
I
those
agree.
things
That
that's
was
like,
pretty. That
really, you
is.
couldn't, there wasn't someone else who was a little closer? Like, even just for, anyway, it's that one. But at the same time, it's kind of like, it's not even a criticism. It's just an example of 80s movies things that you can't get away with anymore.
Right.
Yeah. And then I think my favorite little notes from right towards the end were, actually saying goodbye to E.T., where we have little baby Drew Barrymore. She's in tears and gives him a little kiss on the nose. And then Elliot, who has formed this, deep forever bond, uses their shared language, just says, ouch. And then it's like, I'll be right here. And it's so great. And then the older brother kind of pets him like a dog. And that's it, because it's like, and it's just such a funny, like, to cut it like that instead of Elliot being last, to have the two actually deep connections, and then like, and it's like the older brother, like he's sincere, but he just didn't have the same level of connection as Gertie and Elliot did.
Right. Well, I think that it's one of these things where you find some of like Spielberg's cleverness, like woven even through a silly
Mm-hmm.
movie,
Mm-hmm.
in that like I'm not going to try to get too deep with it, but he's trying to. It's painting that same picture that basically, as you age, you lose this purity of understanding that
Yeah.
ET brings. So even though he's more on the kid side than the adult side. He still doesn't quite get it, and that's why he's like treats him like a dog. Like, oh well, this is how I would treat an animal on Earth, because he's a little bit older, he's a little bit out of that. Whereas the younger they get, the more they get ET.
Mm-hmm.
So, but again, it's like this really, really tiny bit of cleverness that's almost unnecessary for a movie that's this goofy, you know?
Well, yeah, and and then the dog tries to follow E.T. up the ramp into the spaceship, and they have to go get him.
Yeah.
But apparently, there was originally a whole planned ending sequence where Elliot gets to play D&D with the older kids now, because he's accepted now. But they just decided like that's not necessary. I'm describing this end scene, and you're making an awful face.
Sorry, I just petted my dog and he just had a bunch of hair on his back, so I just had like a full of like shed.
Yeah, but
Sorry.
but they
Go ahead.
recognized like once you have that sequence with everyone saying goodbye and the spaceship taking off, like how do you follow that with anything other than the credits, right? Like anticlimactic.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and honestly, like he gets accepted by the older kids when they decide to help him. Like
Yeah.
that like that's
Yeah,
enough. Like they don't
exactly.
have to like play D&D after
Mm-hmm.
that. You
Yeah,
know,
not necessary.
they all
Although
group two sizes and fight together.
yeah.
You know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One comparison though that I want to kind
There we
of
go.
discuss briefly is that like I rewatched this movie a little while back when Stranger Things season 3 had come out and what everyone was talking about, and it's just a reflection too that when we want to talk about like the impact and influence that this movie had, like it's still being felt today. Like one of the reasons that people love Stranger Things so much is that it is evoking movies like E.T.
Yep. Yeah.
Like when people watch Stranger Things and they love it because it feels nostalgic and familiar, it's because it feels like E.T. and other movies like it.
Yeah.
And
And I
it's
would say some of those other movies that we talked about here, like some of the
mm-hmm,
John Hughes ones, the Goonies, like it has a lot of again, not the humor and the vulgarity of the John Hughes, but that sort of that again, that realism sort of it's kind of a weird, like that's sort of the funny thing about the John Hughes movies is like there's this realism that's sort of like twist, like kind of squeezed a little bit in a
yeah,
way that's like
it's the kind of
hyper real.
hyper real. Yeah, that was
Yeah, hyper real. Yeah. And this has that Stranger Things has a lot of that,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So yeah. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what it's doing.
Yeah, it's so it's one of those movies where I think, I don't want to make any claim for you on where you feel like you're going to move it on the list when we get to the end, but for me, it's one of those where if it was just a list based on my own personal enjoyment of the movie, it would be considerably lower, but the fact that it has been so influential and has become such a huge cultural touchstone makes it hard for me to really say that it doesn't belong on a list like this.
Right. And yes, and I've been thinking a lot about it because like sorry, excuse me.
Gesundheit.
Um, again, like my initial mindset whenever I think or talk about this movie is to be like snarky and joke about it, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and so I make the joke to myself, like, well, it shouldn't even be on this list. Like, it's a stupid movie, and it's not that enjoyable. Like, it. But you're right. Like, I also know deep down, like, I get what the talent was that went into this. I get why some of the things feel a certain way. I get what it was trying to do. I get why people love it. I get all of that. And you're right. I think you actually said it best in that if I was making a list of the 100 movies I like the best, this wouldn't be on it.
Yeah.
But if it's the 100 most influential movies, it's probably in the right place. But it's not called that either. So it's like, where do I put this? In that
Mm-hmm.
this is my list. Influential is part of it. What I enjoy is part of it. Quality of production is part of it. Like, I don't know where this goes for me. I
Yeah.
don't. I don't. And it's kind of weird, and it's just been a weird feeling for ever since. But when I knew we were going to watch it, it obviously ramped up when I did watch it, and I realized that I still felt the same. To even now talking about it and reflecting on some of the great points you've brought about, like, again, reminding me of the things that I know it does well that you think are great, and some of the things that are funny, the non sequiturs, like all that. Like, there's a lot of that in there that I kind of spin into a joke scenario because of just how I
Mm-hmm.
approach the movie, and so like I'm just talking because again I don't know where I land on it from the
Yeah.
perspective of this list.
Well, and all of that is 100% fair, right? But I think it's also, we can look at it as like the very idea of having a snarky reaction to it is predicated on an understanding that this is a well-regarded movie, right? So
Yep.
the snark, the feeling, the impulse for snark is a pushback against a common understanding that this is one of the greatest movies, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it'll probably just be like a gut thing,
Mm-hmm.
when
Well,
And
that's how we're putting everything on all of these lists because
yeah,
I've occasionally looked back through the order that we had things in, and when we're doing these one or two at a time and placing them that way, occasionally what that leads to is in the moment it feels like, yeah, I think it belongs above Bonnie and Clyde, but below whatever. It's like uh, uh, just in terms of arbitrary titles. But occasionally you look back and you kind of might feel differently after a while. It's like, is this where it belongs? So we can only ever be putting it where we want it today.
right.
Yeah. But in any event, that's E.T., the extraterrestrial. And
Uh,
I will go ahead and say, I would show it to kids today. I think it would hold up.
yeah, kids would still think it's great.
Yeah. Hmm.
So,
Yeah. With that said, do we want to move on to the Grapes of Wrath?
dude, I was trying to see where I left my charger
Oh.
for my computer, and it doesn't look like it's up here.
Okay. Well, if you want to run and get it, I'll do the
Yeah, you do the
brief.
intro. I'll do
Yeah.
that. While I'm downstairs, I'm gonna feed him. That takes literally 5 seconds, but
All right.
I can tell he wants it. So
Stopwatch. All right. So, The Grapes of Wrath is a 1940 drama based on the book by John Steinbeck. It was directed by John Ford, who directed a lot of other famous movies like Rio Grande and trying to think of like some of the other. The, the thing I pulled up was not the best place to go for a quick reference list of John Ford's movies, but certainly a well-regarded director. In some ways, it was a little bit interesting to have him be the choice for the director of this movie because um, politically, the book is very pro-union, and in terms of that type of politics, whereas John Ford himself, as a human being, was actually very conservative, and so it was interesting, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, that he chose to make this movie. But as he said in interviews, he set out to make a movie to focus on the characters and following them and having empathy with them without necessarily engaging directly with the politics. And yet, the politics can't help but be part of it because that is the story being told. Yeah, he also directed The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Stagecoach, did a lot of westerns. How the West was. Well, let's see. Boy, he did a whole bunch of movies. You can look him up just as easy as I can. Yeah, so this was a movie that came out all the way back in 1940. It was nominated for. Oh, one thing we didn't talk about in regards to E.T. was the awards, but that's okay. Um, it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor for Henry Fonda, Best Screenplay, Best Sound, and Best Film Editing. And then it also won for Best Actress in a Supporting Role for Jane Darwell, who played Mama Ma Jode. And then it was apparently John Ford's second consecutive Oscar because he had won. I'm trying to click to stupid things, and I will say, this is a total tangent. Dear IMDb, for a website that has been continuing to try to make yourself indispensable and I assume try to turn a profit, you have made your website increasingly difficult to use. Anyway, that's me complaining about stuff. He won Best Director for The Grapes of Wrath, and he had been nominated for Best Director for Stagecoach the year before, and then won Best Director again in 1942 for How Green Was My Valley. So 3 years consecutive he was nominated, and he won the second and third one of those three. So, The Grapes of Wrath.
yeah,
This was not either of our first time seeing it, I don't think.
nope. definitely not.
No. I will say, well, I will say just as a first line to my review, although I had seen it before, it resonated with me a lot more this time than the last time. And I think part of that was just because when I was seeing it the first time, I didn't know the story at all. I think I had just less of a perspective on like what the story meant. It felt much more abstract and not connected to my real life. And I was watching it because it's important as opposed to being able to engage with the actual story.
Right. And so I have a different perspective on it because I was exposed to this like very young. I've for whatever reason, there's been at least 3 classes that I've taken where this book was part of the course. So I've read the book at least 3 times, and I can't remember if I did it once more just on my own. I don't think so. I've read the book 3 times and seen the movie all 3 times that I read the book, plus then 1 or 2 additional times since then. So rewatching it this time, it didn't bring a lot of new stuff to me.
Hmm.
I I think it's going to be great to hear you talk about like sort of in the context of today what this meant to you because it didn't hit me that way. Like I see the things that you were sort of hinted at
Hmm.
via some of the text that we shared, but I knew the story so inside and
Yeah.
that it didn't hit me the same way. And I think my summation of this movie is that what basically what they did here was they took a very great piece of literature and they delivered a movie that was competent in executing what was great about that piece of literature while also using what's great about the movies. You
Oh,
know,
okay. Yeah.
scenery and the Grand West scenic parts and like things that you couldn't get out of the book.
Hmm.
But it didn't ever betray the initial theme of the book and tells the story of why the book is so important in such a true way. And
Hmm.
it's such a difficult thing where it's like the whole joke of like, oh well, I read the book's better than the movie, or the movie's better than the book. In this, they're while they tell literally the exact same story, each one stands on its own.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, I say yeah, like I agree. It's more a matter of like I understand your point because I actually haven't read the book. Whereas you had like I guess it came up in 3 different classes, it never did for me. And like none of my English classes or anything ever had us read this book. And so I
Yeah,
haven't read the book. But
yeah.
I was kind of
I
nodding
read
in
it in
agreement.
elementary school, high school, and in college.
Yeah. I was sort of
Yeah,
nodding in agreement, more a matter of thinking about how it's great when a book and a film make complementary versions of the story,
yeah,
where each one gives something back to the other. Like you can enjoy the book more having seen the movie, and you can enjoy the movie more having read the book. And I haven't read the book for this one, but I'm just thinking of other examples where I think that's true. For example, I think The Life of Pi is a good example of a book that is good and a movie that is good, but they're good in different ways because they're different mediums, but they're good in ways that complement each other.
yep. I think that's the same. I think in hindsight, I almost feel like Jurassic Park landed that way.
Yeah.
Initially, I always felt like the book was better because the movie was missing so many plot points. But going back, like, and especially knowing like the technical challenges of some of the stuff that were in there, it's like when I rewatched the original Jurassic Park, like it's still fun, it's still scary, it's still a big
Yeah.
dinosaur movie, and 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 it's
Spielberg,
different.
man.
Yeah. So it's not the same as this, where like this movie literally ticks the plot points of the book one by one by one by one. I mean,
Hmm.
there's nothing new in this. There's nothing different. It doesn't really change any of that, but it it is cool to see those kinds of things. Like it isn't just a retelling of the book story.
Hmm.
It adds the movie element, the big screen element to it.
Right. Um, just to briefly touch on that big screen quality to it, I had the opportunity to go see Lawrence of Arabia on the big screen as part of a recent Fathom Events thing, and Boy, if there's a movie that is transformed by being on a big screen, it's that one. We'll certainly be talking more about Lawrence of Arabia once we get, crack the top 10 in the list. But, there are definitely movies where it makes a big difference. But in any event, I think a perfect illustration of what you're saying about this one is that, like, the scene that really kind of hooked me rewatching this time was that candlelit scene in the deserted house with was it like Muley,
Yeah.
when we're hearing about what happened to the family, and family's getting tracked away, and just seeing the haunted look on his face as he tells the story, and the lighting in that moment, and just how haunted he looks, and the sound and everything. It's like that is something movies can do that is much more difficult than for a book,
Right.
right? A book can tell a haunting story, but as human beings, we are just hardwired to react to that sort of eye contact and nonverbal cues and the facial expressions and the sounds and of the voice. And like that engages different parts of our brain than just reading it would.
Right.
And so that scene in particular, just the lighting of it, the performance of it, for a 1940 movie, felt so contemporary. We think of 1940 movies as being, like, Philadelphia Story, or some of the screwball comedies, or even with the dramas like Alfred Hitchcock movies or something like that, right? Where it feels heightened just stylistically. But this movie is so raw in a lot of places, even when the characters are speaking in these practically poetic soliloquies.
Right. And a lot of that dialogue does come straight from the book.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
That's part of what makes the book phenomenal is the interactions between the characters. Obviously, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's the whole point of the movie. I mean, the movie would be good without the end, but the end makes the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or
Well,
the end of the book.
well,
It's the summation of all of this and all of the interaction between everybody. So
So, having not read the book myself, but only read sort of about it through conversations about the movie, my understanding is that the book has additional ending scenes that they chose not to include in the movie, probably because having a young woman breastfeed an adult man in a barn is probably pushing the limits of what the production code would have allowed them to do at the time.
correct. But it's not a ton. Like it's not like an entire plot piece is missing.
Yeah, it's just it sort of changes the closing note from one that is sort of like resolute to one that's sort of more kind of quietly sad. It sounds like.
Yeah, and maybe and honestly, yeah, I guess thinking about the fact that I always was sad, but like I've always left the movie less resolute and more quietly sad. But maybe that's
Mm.
just because I know I've have a different feeling of going into the ending always.
Hmm.
Um,
Could
because
be.
that is never how I've left the movie as resolute. Like
Well,
I've
I wonder. See, part of where I wonder about that is just because I have to say, when I hear Mama Jode give that speech that closes the movie, the secret thought I have inside is she's wrong. Like she's trying to say that like it will always survive because we're the people. Like they can't get away with this forever. They can't treat us like this. We're the people. We'll survive. And I'm sort of like, not always.
Yeah, and that's how I took it. Is that like this is wrong? Like that it was like all bluster because of, but the words. Well, and I've always felt like that's kind of part of the point of this whole thing is that, and why the book is written with such eloquent language. It's almost like this weird way of saying actions speak louder than words, but in such a long poetic way of like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you can talk like this and you can do this and you can say you believe in this, but like when you actually are challenged in a situation, like what are your actual values and like how are you actually going to behave? For the whole thing, from the depression to how you're going to work to the, all of the things with everybody, like that felt like a common theme of this is like, we can talk about what we're going to do all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But this movie is like, it's almost like the sort of extreme survivor of like stripping them down to, okay, how are you going to behave when you're in this kind of a situation?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter how cool you talked. Like, you got to have to choose an action. And that's why that end like monologue like doesn't resonate. Like, I felt like that's just like, it was telling what the book was trying to do too, in that it was painting this fake, like, oh, we're going to put these words behind it, but it didn't matter because everything that had happened, like, they knew who they were now. Like, they knew what they believed and they knew what they had chosen to do, and they knew the path that they had decided to take with all of these things. And none of it's like good or bad. Like, it's all, like you said, it's just kind of quietly sad that like this is where we ended up, but everybody knows how they decided to behave in the situation,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, and I think to me, like, I think that's the thing. Like, I think, I mean, I wouldn't have used those terms you did about quietly sad. But that's how I mean, again, partly because I'm so exposed to the story. Like, from the
Mm-hmm.
beginning to the end, I am quietly sad. I'm never bawling. I'm never like, oh, this is so unfair, or oh my
Mm-hmm.
god, I'm so angry, or I can't believe that would happen, or like, oh, that sucks. Like, it's all just sort of like this just sort of weight of what these guys are going through, what these people are going through, and these decisions they're having to make. And they can talk all they want about how cool it's going to be and how we're going to move here and it's going to be great and we're going to do this and we're a strong family. But, they keep getting cut to the bone of like what they have to do. And like, none of that means anything. None of their talk means anything. Like, they have to make these decisions. And
Mm-hmm.
it is just quietly sad. I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And the movie hits all of those points the same that the book does.
I think I just, what I felt like from the movie's ending, just me watching the movie, having read the book, it feels like the movie is trying to play that moment straight, where it's trying to say her message is kind of like, we will carry on no matter what they do with us and do to us, and then someday it'll be okay again. But I feel like the movie is trying to have us admire her determination and sort of find nobility in her circumstances and her will to carry on through all of that. And I admire that at the same time that a part of the cynical part of me wants to say that's all fine and good, but there are a lot of people who felt that way right up until the very end where they were crushed underfoot. And so I think part of what I was thinking about that, because when I talked about having it feel like it resonated with me more today, is that when I had watched it previously, I was definitely watching it in the context of, oh, this is that great movie that I've heard about, I should watch it. And I'm watching it like as a story that is like completely isolated from any kind of a real world context, because I didn't live through the Dust Bowl, and honestly I hadn't, I wasn't incapable of intellectually understanding the story, but it didn't feel like part of any of my actual life experience.
Right.
And it's not that it does now. It's not like I have now been through the Dust Bowl when I hadn't been 20 years ago. But it was more a matter of just, I think, an increased perspective and ability to sort of read into that. And the fact is that even though, first of all, it's based on real history, but it's just one of those things that there are so many echoes in this movie about the way the Okies are treated in this story that are just so resonant today with the immigrant crisis and people seeking asylum because the situation is bad where they're coming from, and just the way people treat them and the way that they're put in camps and the way people act like they're somehow trying to get something they don't deserve, and the way that they're just trying to live their lives and do what they can to survive. And all of that just felt very fresh and resonant in our current modern world today. And there's a little bit of irony in that kind of the real history is that although certainly this was not true of every single person who was displaced during the Dust Bowl in this time period, the truth is that a lot of those families that did move to California did actually do pretty okay for themselves after a while.
Right.
You know, they moved to a place where there actually was a lot of new industry and they found new jobs and then they did fine. Probably because they're white.
Yeah.
But but at the same time, there's moments in this movie where, like, there's a gas station attendant, and like they're in their crisp uniforms, and they're looking at these people, and they're like, how can they even live like that? It's like they're not even human, and it's just like, what? It just in the sense of recognizing the commonalities of the way people treat anyone who's down on their luck, and seeing the people with that same attitude today. And it's just that's what made me not only appreciate it as a quality movie telling an interesting dramatic story, but made it feel relevant and vibrant today for me when I rewatched it.
Right.
Just for anyone who hasn't seen the movie or read the book, the basic premise is that it's set during the period known as the Dust Bowl, when it was during the Great Depression, and there was in the Midwest an extreme weather pattern that led to a whole lot of farmers being unable to make enough, grow enough crops to survive financially. And then because you had all of these small farmers who couldn't get by because they had no, capital or savings to fall back on, all just got, scooped up and shoved out of the way by, the corporate farms, which, I'm not going to just come out and say corporation equals automatically bad, but certainly there's some bad behavior in this time period and in this story, where they just sort of get scooped out and displaced, and you have these families that have lived in the same house for 4 generations, not knowing anything except the subsistence farming that they've always had, and now it's kind of like, nope, you're homeless now, figure it out.
Yep.
And them having to do that. But like, even this family, as hard off as they are, they've got much of their family is, physically capable of work. They have a truck, so they're even better off than some. But even still, them having to travel across the country, trying to find somewhere where there's work. But the problem is there's so many people displaced all at the same time.
Right.
That not only are you competing against all of them for jobs, but there starts to become so many that everywhere you go, people start going, oh boy, more Okies, as in like from Oklahoma.
Yep.
And you start becoming this plague of locusts to all of the people who actually, live in the places that you're going to. And that's going to make it harder to get by. And you start feeling like the scum of the earth. The Jode family kind of goes through this. They're losing their older family members along the way because they can't afford, good food, and they're trying to drive all day. And then they get into places where they are so desperate that there are people who are willing to exploit them for cheap labor. And that's where we start getting into the idea of, how unions come into play in that exact situation.
Right.
And so we have Tom Joad is sort of the central character, had gone to prison for murder, in a circumstance that was more dumb than malicious. It was like he got in a bar fight and ended not even really accidentally, but just like he got a knife in me and then I caved in his head with a shovel. Like, it's stupid bar fight, not some, seedy thing, right?
Well, yeah, but it ties in later. It just shows that he's not going to back. Like I said, there comes this point where it's like he can talk as eloquently as he wants, but when like push comes to shove, like he's going to try to shove harder.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make him bad, and he's not a bad guy or a bad character or malicious, but like it makes it a choice that he's made a couple of times now. Mm-hmm. By the end which I'm sure you'll get to, but that's kind of what I was getting at earlier, is that, he has this really, like, that's why I feel like part of the story is like words versus actions. Like, he talks this big game about like how that wasn't a big deal. It was stupid. It's silly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like noble guy who's going to lead my family through all this depression. And then he just ends up killing another guy. Like, it's, which I know it's not that simple, but it's like, that's.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't disagree. I mean, certainly the facts are exactly what you said, but I do feel a little bit like the different.
Well, I'm
I
painting
feel,
a little bit more caustically than I think it's
yeah,
meant to be in the movie, but it's to again to the point of why I see the end differently, is that I see how they talk versus what happens. And again, it is not their fault that the situation that they're put in,
hmm
but they make decisions along the way that kind of cut to their core being, and it's not always as eloquent as they wish they were. And that's a human thing. Like, all of us are like that. Like, we all wish we could be how we talk, how we could be. But sometimes, like, and we relate to Tom. Like, we understand, like, if someone stabbed you with a knife in a bar fight, you would want to hit him with a shovel.
yeah.
And as you get to describe how the strike came to pass, like, you get why that happens. Like, they kill Casey, right? Isn't that
Yeah.
right? So
Well, and not only that, but they were attacking him. He was literally defending himself.
right. Like, he's not coming out and, like, and that's why I said I made it a little more caustic. Like, he's not coming out and, like, just killing people,
Yeah.
but, like, some of the situations he's ending up in and the decisions he's making end up in other people dead. So it's kind of like, again, he's not a bad guy, and he's not an anti-hero. He's not a villain. He's just a guy who's in these weird situations, and this is what keeps happening. But as eloquent as he wants to talk, this keeps happening. So
I am fascinated with that perspective because, first of all, I can't find anything wrong with it. Like, I'm not disagreeing with anything you said, except that it is a very different framing than I would have given the same incident. Because rather than saying that there's an element of like talk versus action or something like that, no matter how fancy you want to talk, that's really what it comes down to. Which again, it's like, there's no fault in that argument that I can find. But the way I would have put it is the irony in having such similar, like superficially similar actions be driven by such different motivations. Because on the one hand, the bar fight, even he frames it as, it wasn't even about anything. It was just dumb because he was drunk and he got in a fight with a guy. And it didn't mean anything to either one of them except just in that moment. Whereas when it happens later, it is specifically in the defense of his friend who has inspired in him a desire to do good for his fellow man. And he is there for that reason, even though he knows it's probably a danger and a risk to himself. And then when they are attacked and his friend who showed him this new way of thinking is killed, he is further motivated to take further action out of idealistic, like, it's not that it's like a well thought out plan to kill this policeman, the tin badge, right? Not that it's well thought out, but my point is that it is motivated out of a selfless desire to do good for his fellow man, as opposed to, I was dumb and drunk. And so I thought it was ironic in that sense, but at the same time, I think it's a testament to the complexity of this story, the layers, that we can describe the same two events in those two different ways and have them really both be right.
right, and the way I'm describing it still accepts all of your arguments.
Mm-hmm.
It's not saying all that. It's just saying that, like, hey, ultimately, like, it doesn't, like, you can keep doing all this, but, like, you can end up in these, like, really terrible situations, and you're going to react the way you're going to react as a human. And we can understand as a human being why Tom Joad would have done what he did at the bar fight, why what he would have done at the strike. We can recognize that he is a different person and had different motivations in each one, but recognize why he came to those decisions. and none of his speeches and his this and all that and every way they talk and all this eloquency that's tied around the tapestry of this story makes any difference when it comes down to the core events that define him.
Right. Well, and so like that's why I'm trying to emphasize I'm not in any way arguing with the way you framed it, because I think it is fascinating that both of us have these different perspectives that both completely accurately describe the scenes,
Right.
and neither of
That's why this
them
book is in
conflict. Yeah,
lots of
yeah, neither conflict with one another. In fact, they dovetail together perfectly. I think that's amazing, and it's a reflection. Yeah, like you were just saying, like this is a well-regarded story for a couple of reasons. There's
Yeah, and you, it's why Life of Pi was interesting also, because like the story is obviously telling like a very kind of complete. It does tie itself together at the end, but how you view Pi's reaction through all of that can be very different, based on your own perspective of it. And you can have an argument about what the end ultimately means that is very different from your friend or who read the exact same story or watched the exact same movie.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's interesting and why this evoked that, I think, for you,
Yeah.
is that
Well,
there's
I
just a
mean,
lot to it.
yeah.
It's not just a story about people living through the Depression.
In some ways, I think The Life of Pi is an excellent example of that in particular, just because, like, I think ultimately the most interesting thing about it is that the ending is actively striding toward that deliberate ambiguity of, having it be purposeful to set up that you don't know the truth one way or the other.
Right.
Yeah.
It tries to make it sound like, oh, here's this thing that ties up, but that doesn't really tie quite the way that it's like, yeah. Anyway, but again, that's why this movie is like, that's part of, but these are a lot of the conversations that, again, I'm trying to recollect on things we did back in courses back in high school and college.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a lot of the discussion about this book. What makes it interesting is not just because it tells us a great historical thing about the Depression or the Dust Bowl or any of that stuff. It's an insight into how humans treat each other.
Mm-hmm.
When, like you said, when some people are perceived as kind of lower class, and how that, how people sort of trample on them and take advantage of them,
Mm-hmm.
and use that, and like that fiefdom that sort of exists when that starts to happen, whether it's an immigrant or an Okie, all this stuff. Like, it's very complex in how it makes you feel about that, because it puts you in the perspective of the Jodes and how they're being abused, but then it does step outside and show you that the Jodes aren't perfect either. Like, they're in a terrible situation, but they're not doing everything perfectly. Like,
Right.
and they can sort of pass it off as like, oh, I was drunk in the bar. But again, like, going back to it, like, he killed somebody. Like, he's not like this altruistic hero that's just being oppressed by the system. Like, he's not a perfect man.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't deserve what happened to him and his family via the Dust Bowl,
Right.
and the treatment that then they received after that. And that's why so he goes through this growth, with Casey and all of that, but yet ends up in the same place. And that's, like I said, like, I think when you, again, I never used the term before until you said it, but it's like quietly sad. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he was growing as a person, but yet he still ended up in the same place, and he had to leave, and they had to like talk like how they were going to get through it when they're really not going to get through it. Like, it's just a shitty situation,
Well, but see, the thing is too that I think part of the context for all of that is a question of it gets into the politics of it, of things like unions, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
question of, certainly, without some sort of a collective response, nothing gets accomplished. They continue to be abused and exploited. But
Right.
it's certainly not a guaranteed positive outcome either way. It's more a matter of, like, do you do something at risk to your own personal self for the possible benefit of the larger group versus survive as best you can while everybody sinks. Right? That's kind of like, that's the, is dialectic the right word there? That's the line that Tom straddles, right? You know, it
Right.
is what's best for him personally versus the right thing to do. When even then, it's not necessarily obvious that it's the right thing. It's just a matter of, it's, you know, when they get to that one camp, it seems like we found exactly what we were looking for. Look at this. It's not great, but it's a roof over our head. It's enough money to buy food. That is, we don't have to keep driving. That is way more than we had yesterday. Seems so great. But gosh, what was the deal with all those angry people outside the gate yesterday? And they learn it's literally because those people had the job up until recently for half the money. And because so like it was like they had been getting paid 5 cents a day or a bushel or something like that for picking fruit,
Right.
and they wanted more money because the whole setup of this camp is like that, you know, the 16 tons song is that the only place to buy anything is the company store where they charge ridiculous prices. So whatever you get paid just goes right back to the company store. And you can never actually save anything because they keep you basically, it's in many respects, except that you're technically free to leave, it's slave labor, right?
Right.
It
Yeah.
is, we are paying you just enough to pay back to us for the room and board we give you. And you will never ever get ahead. And we are taking advantage of your position to make a big profit for the bosses,
Right.
right? And so when the old workers wanted more money, the bosses say, fine, there's lots more people who will work for less than you. So they fire them. But then what we learn is, oh, these new people are getting paid the amount that the old workers wanted. But it's like, only for now. They're only doing it so that you would be willing to cross the picket line. And as soon as we go away and stop doing what we're doing, they're going to go back to the lower price. Right? And so it's
Okay.
kind of like it's only the people agitating that even keep it high, but those people are agitating at personal cost.
Right.
And that is just this awful dilemma that is kind of like, hey, everyone, welcome to Capitalism 101. Not to get too political necessarily, but that is what this movie's about, right?
It is. Yeah. And like I said, it illustrates a lot of. I mean, a lot of the. I think again, I'm not by no means like socialist, but like I think that there need to be checks and balance on capitalism. Like I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that the invisible hand works the way that Adam Smith thought it would in the 1700s. Like I
Mm-hmm.
think you need checks at the top to not abuse the power,
Mm-hmm.
and safety nets at the bottom to help protect the people that don't necessarily.
Yeah.
But the rest of the system can operate pretty freely. That's like kind of my short. And then movies like this is. I mean that yeah. I mean stories like this really illustrate that. Like this is an extreme example of no safety net at the bottom via unions or healthcare or whatever, and no checks at the top via extra taxation or rules or regulations, and that's
Mm-hmm.
what ends up happening. This is that extreme example. Outside of sort of the human element that I usually take from the story, that is also part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And I think part of why it didn't resonate for me the same way when I watched it originally was just because I was maybe a little bit more naive politically. And I really watched the story as though this is something that happened back in the old days and it's not like that anymore. And so it felt very far removed, like, oh, well, you know, this was a sad part of our history, and thank goodness we've moved on, except that, you know, we really haven't. It's just a different group of people being put through this, is all. You know, it's There is almost all of these exact same things are happening today.
Yeah.
But it's definitely uh, I found it very relevant and not just like an old movie. Like I say that as someone who likes old movies, including
Hmm.
many that don't necessarily have any particular relevance today other than just being an entertaining story, right?
Right. And yeah, and what I'll say is that, from that part of it, which again I think I introduced at the beginning of our conversation, like I already had that framework from this
Yeah.
story, from knowing it so well. So it's already been a part of how I view the world. Like it's that kind of a piece of the literature, like
Hmm.
that that this is already in my worldview. Um, so that it didn't have that effect on me. But what was interesting to me is that watching the human struggle that they go through is still just as powerful, 50, 60, 70, whatever, how many years,
Hmm.
79 years later.
Yeah.
I mean, is this
Well.
movie 80 years old almost?
Well.
Am I
Yeah.
doing that math right? Yeah,
Yeah.
80 years old.
Right.
And it still holds true, like just what Tom and his family are going through and like how they respond is still interesting to me. And
Yeah.
not because it's an old movie, because it's an interesting look at humans and their condition and when they're put under pressure and how they respond and how they grow and how sometimes that doesn't even matter. Like,
Hmm.
you know,
I.
Tom didn't become a hero. Tom grew, but Tom didn't become a hero. Like, Tom ended up having to, like, go off and leave his family because of what he did.
Hmm.
And nothing really got done.
Although
He's a
that
better
last
person.
that
Yeah.
last speech he gives to Ma Jode though is like a superhero speech though. It's like
Yeah.
wherever people are suffering, I'll be there. It's like the Three Amigos speech.
Right, but he's not going to go do anything. Like he's not. That's the whole thing. It's like what is quietly sad is that he became a better person and he didn't better his situation. And it's like now that's not always our reality. Like sometimes, like I like to think that we do have some agency in what happens to us, but it sometimes doesn't. Like
Hmm.
sometimes this is what happens. You become a better person and you still get the short end of the stick.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
see, I always I thought that the implication was that although he has to leave his family so that they will not be implicated by whatever might happen to him, that his intention was to essentially become like one of the rabble rousers, not necessarily in this place because he has to distance himself from his family, but it's kind of like that superhero origin story. It's like when they were at the camp before that strike one, right? There was the guy who was out there giving speeches until like the bosses came in and ran him out of town, right? I kind of always assumed his intention was essentially to do that.
Which again, part of the complexity of the story is that you can view it that way because that
Mm-hmm.
is what he says. But I watch the story with like they say a lot of stuff and it doesn't really matter. Like it's is that really what he's going to go do? Is it really going to make a difference? Like I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Like that's sort of the point is that he's he's been talking a lot about this improvement, but his bookend of his story is killing a person and killing a person. Even through all of his growth and all of his speeches and all of his superhero development, he killed a guy and he killed a guy.
Mm-hmm.
It is he really now transitioning in? And like you said, you can nuance all of it, and it's important to do that in part of the discussion. But that's kind of what it comes down to. Like it for me,
Mm-hmm.
it's like okay, cool. Like yeah, you can go talk like that. Like we'll see what you do next, Tom.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's how I leave it. Is not I'm not leaving it saying the character of Tom is not going to go become a rabble rouser,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not leaving it saying he's definitely going to fail at that. I'm leaving it saying it's not clear because he's a human being
Certainly
and
easier said than done.
right, and all the transitions he's made so far have not advanced him anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So is this the turning point? Let's hope it is, but there's no indication that it for sure is, and that he's all of a sudden like transitioned into this like hero character, like
Mm-hmm.
like a superhero would have, and it's just a weird layer to the whole story where you you can look at it like you just said. You could look at it the way you did, in that this is his superhero moment, and you can look at it the way that I do, in that, all right, cool, Tom, like, you keep talking a good game, but you sort of keep ending up in the same spot. So let's see what happens next.
Mm-hmm.
And everything across both spectrums could be true. It is incredibly complex where they leave you with this story, and I kind of like that.
Yeah.
It's fun to have that kind of thought process. It's fun to think about that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's fun to be challenged.
Yeah.
You know. So.
And we've talked almost entirely about the story of the movie and not the filmmaking of it.
Yeah,
But
again, at the beginning, I
yeah.
think that is critical to the success of this, because it's what
Mm-hmm.
differentiated it from the book
Yeah.
story. Like, what, not only
Adapted from the Nobel Prize winning novel by George
right,
Steinbeck, John Steinbeck.
right,
Steinbeck. I don't know where that came from. But yeah, so, but I think too, being made by John Ford, for one, I wonder if there's a little bit of, the fact that he didn't actually, like, John Ford, the man, politically, was not really on the side of the story in the sense of, like, his position on unions, for example.
right.
But he empathized with the human storytelling of it and decided to make that the movie and just let the any political aspect of it kind of just be incidental,
Mm-hmm.
which it can't help but be prominent despite being incidental.
Right.
But I wonder if part of this movie's enduring legacy is that framing, because if it had been more overtly political, it might have just been more easily dismissed as propaganda.
Yeah, I could see that.
But certainly, he is an accomplished director who made lots of other, good movies, including lots of westerns. And I think you can see some of that skill set shining through here, where so many of the road scenes being shot on location instead of in a set, and it just gives a lot of verisimilitude to that. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, in many respects, I feel like, despite being made in 1940, the filmmaking in many places feels very contemporary compared to
Right.
what I think of other movies of that time being.
Yeah, because it is less studio driven. It's less, movies at that time. A lot of them were made, and it's why a lot of those movies, like a lot of the older movies that are on this list, like, really stand out outside of just their craft.
Mm-hmm.
Is that they're not part of this, like, machine of just, like, producing movies out of a back lot.
Mm-hmm.
They've taken the time to step outside of Hollywood and go and do something a little bit different. And when they really deliver, it's impressive. And it stands against, not what we do now, but against what you would get if you watched a lot of 1940s movies. Like, you just see a lot of studio churn,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people who were on contract and producing 3 to 4 movies a year, like, just like a job,
Yeah.
as opposed to, like,
Well, you froze up on me a little bit there. But
yeah,
yeah, you're back now. But
yeah,
just like on that note, like the
it
this
helps,
the
by the way. Once you said
the
it helped
studio
when
whole contracting thing was very much still an issue, and in fact, like, Henry Fonda had wanted to avoid getting signed to another multi-year contract with the studio, but was willing to for this role. But that was like part of the behind the scenes stuff. But like, this was a year when one of the competing nominee so Henry Fonda was nominated for Best Actor, but one of his so the other nominees that year, Jimmy Stewart won for The Philadelphia Story, but then there was also Laurence Olivier from Rebecca and Charles Chaplin from The Great Dictator. Like, that's
Jesus,
the time period that this was made in. That those were the contemporaries when this movie was made.
right?
This this was not, and so just the idea that this movie is so it's very naturalistic, compared to a lot of other movies at the time. And part of that
Mhm.
is apparently due to John Ford's preference for having very minimal rehearsals, like just enough to get the blocking right. And then wanting people to really be, very much in the moment and not over rehearsed.
Right.
And I think that that comes through, but it was very atypical for the time, right?
Yeah.
Getting all of the technical stuff really refined, but then the performances being, very, unslick, if that makes sense, rough.
Hmm.
Yeah, but sincere nonetheless. Although some of you hear some of the stories of the way he behaved, and it's there's increasingly some, I think, cultural awareness that being an asshole is not necessarily synonymous with being a genius, and so sometimes you can kind of start to say there might be people who could be artistic geniuses without being an asshole. And like how many people who would have been great get chased out of the business because they have to work with an asshole.
Yeah.
And but apparently, by all accounts, he was kind of an asshole on set, and he would get in screaming fights with the various actors and so on set. But at the same time, it's like is like so many other filmmakers, you have to consider some of that question of like, well, I certainly doesn't excuse the behavior that the movie is good, but it does raise the question of can you consider the film separate?
Yep.
Um, but yeah, some great stuff. So the best picture this year actually went to where is that? Trying to. So he won the best director, but I think why in the world, dear IMDb, are you not showing me this stuff in a sensible order? Um, Best picture went to Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca,
Mm.
um,
Fair
which
enough.
is interesting just because, like, although I certainly am a fan of Alfred Hitchcock as a director, another noted asshole, just in terms of his,
Yeah.
reputation as a person versus being his artistic quality as a director. But I don't think of Rebecca as really one of my favorites. I wouldn't even put it in my top five Hitchcock movies.
No, I mean, and it's not on this list, so.
No. Um, but yeah, so certainly I think the sort of naturalistic feel of the performances and um, is such an interesting pairing with the frequently very artful and poetic language of the dialogue.
Yep.
And that obviously is both a directorial style, but also comes down to the performances, right? Like we had, Tom is our central character, and he has all of his various conflicts. But Jane Darnell won for Best Supporting Actress as Ma Jode, and I think that that's interesting because it's certainly not a flashy role, but it's just she's so inherently sympathetic and human. You know what I mean? It's just like you love her and you root for Tom so that he can make her happy.
Right.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's
Yeah,
like
no, I agree. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
and so and our heart breaks along with hers when she's realizing like I'm losing him again. I just have to hope he'll be okay. We have to just keep on doing what we do if we can, as long as we can. Just trying to hold it all together. She's just such a powerfully sympathetic character, and I think that's why she, deservedly won that award because she's a memorable presence in the movie, even though from a plot perspective, she really doesn't do very much except motivate Tom, right?
Yeah. But she delivers that. I mean, like, that's that.
Mm-hmm.
She's asked to step outside of that role and to, like you said, like, kind of deliver the motivation to the audience as well as Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even though her, like, plot point is to Tom,
Yeah.
her message resonates with the entire audience.
Right.
He almost functions as a inspirational narrator
Yeah.
in a way, you know?
Well, like if Tom is the hands of the story, she's the heart, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to put it too. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, yeah,
So yeah, so great stuff.
that's good looking ahead.
Great performances. You're looking ahead at the list.
Yeah, to where I'm
Yeah.
going to put these. So,
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move to that then. Have you made your decision, or did you preemptively say that with before having made your decision?
no, so I hadn't, and that's part of why I was kind of getting distracted. Is like the conversation sort of trailed into, okay, we've kind of covered the bulk of this. Like I felt us moving into this part of the
Yeah, yeah.
conversation.
I think we're
Kind
there.
of jumped the gun a little bit, but um, I I just really started thinking about that ET thing, and now I'm stuck. And it's not like I'm gonna ask you for help on my own list, but
Well, we
I'm
can talk about it more for sure.
right. So if you scroll down into the to the sort of 53 to like 58,
Mm-hmm.
and look at my list and what I've got in there. So I'm All the President's Men, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, American Graffiti, North by Northwest. I
Mm-hmm.
have One Night. That's kind of that's sort of the films that I have there.
Yeah.
I think E.T. belongs in that block
Yeah.
based on what we talked about. But I'm having a real hard time, like, because again, how I feel about it, like, I like North by Northwest more, so I don't really want to put E.T. above it, but I do when I
Right.
think about it, like, does E.T. have more to it than North by Northwest? Maybe, but American
Well,
Graffiti is kind of the same. I'm stuck in this limbo of these areas. But to your point, like I can put it here and I'm going to forget about it 2 weeks from now anyway.
so there are times when I sometimes so the way we have approached this list so far, when we reorient it and put movies in a different list, I've actually been thinking about the method of it. Now we didn't. I've been thinking about it much more than we did when we started, which is just a sort of very intuitive. Where would you put it on the list? But because we've already done an episode where we each added a write-in, right? Um, but because the truth of the matter is, if we were making a top 100 list from scratch, probably a lot of these movies wouldn't be on it at all, much less being 82 or whatever, where it becomes 82 instead of 100, just because there's even more movies on there that we would put further down. Because the way we've constructed this is you never move anything further down than 102, because we have the original 100 in our two write-ins, right?
Right.
So nothing ever moves any further down than that. But that leaves very little room for what other movies we would add to the list otherwise, right?
Right.
And then there's also the question of we're kind of just gut checking it when we move it to wherever we put it.
Yeah.
As opposed to
tracking here.
yeah, but as opposed to what if we had originally decided that we would rank each movie like out of 10, like quality of filmmaking, personal enjoyment, lasting cultural impact, right? If we
Oh,
ranked each out of 10 and then got a score, we could rank it that way, right?
right. And then gut check when they're tied.
Right, like so that would have been a different way to do it. And in that context, if we were ranking them that way, I mean, I think ET would have been an example of one of those that would have been extremely high on that cultural impact. That's probably a 10 out of 10 on that one, I would think. But
Yeah, I mean,
maybe
I'd even
lower
have
on
to
some
go,
of the others, right?
yeah. So that's not helping me.
Well, hey, I'm just rambling to give you time. I'm stalling for you. Is what
All
I'm
right,
doing.
here's where I'm going to put it. This is what I just described. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at this as a realm of movies, and I'm looking at my block of 5 right around the midpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I like North by Northwest better. I think it has enough cultural impact that even if it's not as strong as ET's, because of my own personal like for the movie, like if you gave me an option and said every weekend for the rest of your life you have to either watch North by Northwest or ET, like I pick North by Northwest 10 out of 10 times.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put it just below that
Okay.
at E7.
It's interesting because I was looking at that because the one that you are putting it just above by placing it there is It Happened One Night. And I was just realizing, looking back through this list, that there is a handful of the, quote, screwball comedies like The Philadelphia Story and It Happened One Night and, you know, trying to, what is it, Bringing Up Baby. And, like some of those movies that kind of all start to blend together in my head, frankly. It's
Yeah,
like,
and well, that's part of like us watching them. Like we're doing this gut check. Like at the time when we just watched them,
yeah.
all of a sudden, like His Girl Friday, like means a little bit more because its recency has.
Well, also, that was my own personal write in because it's one of my personal favorites. So that one's different in my mind.
Oh
But
yeah,
yeah.
fair enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, the recency I think has a part in the how we're ranking them.
Yeah, well, and that's fine too because this list is never intent. It's not set in stone, right? The whole idea is that we're just it is whatever we feel in the moment.
Yeah. And so what I
Um,
feel in the moment is that it's better than It Happened One Night from a overall. If I was sort of blending the three things you were talking about,
hmm
but North by Northwest's personal enjoyment and American Graffiti's personal enjoyment make those better than this.
hmm hmm
Because I would say the same thing for American Graffiti. Again, if you gave me the choice of having to watch one or the other, I would take American Graffiti. Um,
Yeah, I feel like
I know you
I
have American Graffiti in a different place than I do.
well, yeah, well, I'm also just sort of feeling like both of those are kind of I place both of them in the same box in my head of movies that I would be kind of unhappy with having to watch over and over. Not that I don't like them, but having to repeat view them.
So I'm trying to remember if I talked about this when we watched it because it feels like something I've reflected on since then, and like having seen American Graffiti like another time outside of this.
hmm
Part of the reason that it's so high on the list for me is that it was really, really important movie to my dad.
Well, same. We did talk about that when
We
we
did?
talked about
Okay.
it.
Yeah, I felt like I had reflected, but I didn't. I guess we must have reflected at the time. And so it was an important movie for us to watch together. And that's
hmm
why I think it feels more enjoyable to me. So
I
yeah, I guess we did
yeah
talk about
no
that.
I felt the same way. I would say that a substantial percentage of my enjoyment of the movie was not even the movie itself, but talking to my dad about the movie.
Okay. So we did. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so in any event, though, yes, American Graffiti you have just over North by Northwest on this list for context, since other people are not necessarily looking at the sheet while we talk about it. But so, what about the Grapes of Wrath?
Yeah. Sorry, something weird. It like left a blank.
Now, I did that because I moved ET down. I'll shift everything back up once
Oh,
you've
okay. Let's put everything
placed
back up
Grapes
then.
of Wrath. Yeah.
So I was kind of putting it into not even so far down, like more in that like Treasure of Sierra Madre, Taxi Driver, Jaws, like in
Mm-hmm.
that upper 20s. Um, it's probably more important than Jaws. I think it's more complex. But the reason I like Grapes of Wrath is the discussion we have around it.
Mm-hmm.
I think Taxi Driver has an equal amount of discussion around it from the human condition and is a more enjoyable movie. So I'm going to put it below Taxi Driver but above Jaws.
Okay.
That's my reasoning.
I like it, or rather, I find your reasoning sound. Whoops, I just did the wrong thing. There we go.
All right.
I'm shifting cells around on a spreadsheet.
Ooh, if we do this right, sorry, I'm just looking at our next movies.
Yeah.
So we've got Some Like It Hot in Chinatown as our next pair.
Mm-hmm.
Then It's a Wonderful Life is in the next pair.
Yeah.
So if we do this correctly, we could be watching It's a Wonderful Life and On the Waterfront, the other great Christmas movie, leading into the Christmas season.
Yeah.
That could be fun, you know.
Yeah. Let me think. I'm gonna take E.T. and I'm gonna, I think, put it. You know what? Because of exactly what we talked about with it, I'm going to put it between two other movies, one of which I think is important and I really like it, and another where primarily it's there because of its influence as opposed to just how much I liked it. I'm going to put it in between The Maltese Falcon and Intolerance.
Yeah, that's fair. So you got it in the upper 30s, where I have it like right at around 50 something.
Yeah,
Yep.
you've got it at 56. And for me, it's a little higher than that, but still being placed, you know, I think there's a lot to like about it, but it's only so high for me because of its clear social
Right.
relevance and cultural
Yeah.
impact.
It's such a touch point. Like I'm the same way. Like it's a movie I make fun
Hmm.
of, but it has a ride at Universal Studios, or it did. You
Yeah,
know,
no, I think it's still there.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
We didn't even
ride
talk
in
about the
basket. Yeah.
we didn't even talk about I don't know if it's really even a controversy, but the whole idea of Spielberg doing a re-edition where he took guns out of cops' hands and put flashlights in them, and then later regretted doing that.
I don't even remember that happening.
No, well, for the 2002 re-release, they digitally altered some of the shots during that final bicycle chase, where some of the cops were holding guns, and Spielberg decided during that re-release that that was like too scary, so he edited out and put walkie-talkies and flashlights in their hands instead. And but then later he felt like that was, a lot of money spent altering that when it was really fine to begin with, and he kind of regretted, adulterating his original vision.
So in the version we just watched, which did
It
it
is the
have?
altered version. Yeah.
It is?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, if you look it up, it's like one of the shots is when the kids are all riding their bicycles up to the police cars just as they take off. Some of those cops were actively like holding guns, not even pointing at the kids, but like clearly like at the ready.
Mm.
But now they're walkie-talkies. But in any event, I'm going to move Grapes of Wrath, I think, to. I'm going to put it. Ooh. Boy,
It's a
we're,
hard one to beat,
I'm
right?
keeping it pretty high, so it's so hard to choose when they're higher, right?
Right.
Uh,
Like it's one that almost is where it belongs. We're just moving it
yeah.
just out of personal preference for other movies that we know better and
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
more. Yeah,
I
like it's
think
not bad where it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm only moving it a little ways down. I'm going to put it in between, just above the Treasure of the Sierra Madre, but just below His Girl Friday, which, as previously mentioned, is a personal favorite of mine. So that's an example of one that, how much I enjoy it personally is weighted higher than whatever its specific cultural relevance would be.
Right.
All right, so as we finish, I ended up with the Grapes of Wrath actually in one position lower than you, at 29, whereas you have it at 28. And then I put ET at 38, whereas you have it at 56.
Yes.
All right, and
Well,
so,
yeah. I mean, we're looking at the movies that either of us have above Grapes of Wrath, and they're all very deep
yeah.
discussion, very layered movies. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just really impactful stuff that we also like.
Yeah. It's interesting just as like in the context of having opinions change on things and shifting up and down a little bit. For example, like I have The Shawshank Redemption very high right now at 25, and I'm sort of feeling not like I dislike it now, but I'm sort of looking at that list and feeling like I'm not sure now that it deserves to be that high. You
Yeah,
know?
and I'm sort of looking at so my what are essentially my current top three are
Mhm.
Apocalypse Now, Godfather 2, and Bridge on the River Kwai, and
Mhm.
I am super comfortable with those continuing to move up the list. Like
Mhm.
those are three of my all time favorite movies from they're 10 out of 10s on all three
Mhm.
things that you talked about for me,
Mhm.
for my own personal like watching.
Yeah. Well, and then we're agreed on Apocalypse Now. Like you actually have it one position higher than me, but I have it, just under that. So my top three of the ones we've watched so far: Doctor Strangelove, Apocalypse Now, and then Shawshank Redemption. And that's one where I put it very high right after we watched it. But I look back at that list now, and I'm feeling like, do I really think it needs to be that high? If I were ranking it today, I would probably not put it nearly that high.
Right. So you feel probably as passionately though about your top two as
Yeah.
I do about my top three.
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay with my four
Well,
and five. I mean, that's
yeah.
Triple, Sierra Madre, and Taxi Driver. I mean, those are
Mm-hmm.
good movies. But
Yeah, and I've got Raiders of the Lost Ark and Amadeus, and then His Girl
which
Friday coming up.
I
Yeah,
love that you have my
yeah,
writing above your writing
yeah,
and
and
higher
and
than I
higher
have. I
than
mean,
you have it. Well, but when we did the write-in too, you may recall that part of what I said at that time was, if you hadn't picked it, I might have. So
yeah. No, I know. I
yeah.
just think it's funny. That was my write-in, and you
Hmm.
have it higher
Hmm.
than your own write-in and my ranking.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're
Anyway.
going into some. This is going to be a fun
Yeah.
discussion of
Hmm.
these two movies for very different reasons. I
Well,
think.
right. In particular, like, well, Some Like It Hot it's just fun. It's so fun. It's a funny movie, and it's fun to talk about, and I think we'll enjoy that. And then
Well,
Chinatown.
but it also moved the cultural like barometer or whatever you want a little bit, and I think that
Mhm.
that's important. I think that's why the movie's on there. Like
Yeah.
it made again, it's not a gay movie, it's not a trans movie, but it's like it like hints enough at it
Hmm.
that it just kind of shifted everybody because it used really powerful people and
Hmm.
really good story to just kind of change the conversation a little bit. And I
Yeah.
think that's important to talk about because I think that's why it's so high. It's really fun. It's really funny,
Yeah.
but it
But
did more than that.
well, there's
Yeah,
absolutely stuff hinted at in there that could really only have been hinted at the time, and
right.
yet we can see now, looking back, we can see where, like, oh well, if this were made today, that scene would have probably gone differently.
Yeah,
That sort of thing, right? And
but I like that it was bold enough to do those things, and
mhm,
that it was willing to do that with big stars.
yeah,
And I think that's going to be part of the fun of the talk about it. Like, and not only just we're going to talk about the funny scenes. Like, I mean, it's hilarious. And that's why I think the culmination of this is like they didn't make a movie that was overtly like trying to like shift the conversation. They just made a really funny movie that happened to shift the conversation, and that
mhm,
was probably the best way for this to go.
yeah.
You know,
Well,
and
and I mean, it's certainly like I don't know if it's. I wouldn't probably say it's Marilyn Monroe's biggest movie, but it's certainly the one I associate her with the most.
right,
But and it's just fun. It's so fun. I'm looking forward to that one a lot. And
yeah,
then
it's a lot of
Chinatown.
yeah,
Chinatown is one of those where, like, it's certainly a powerful noir mystery that has all sorts of great qualities about it. But just in terms of cultural relevance today, Roman Polanski, man, that's, we talk about, like, Me Too and reevaluating some of that stuff. And then also his name is kind of in the buzz recently too, because he's literally a side character in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So,
yeah. It's there's like that baggage that comes with this, and it's
hmm,
like that's gonna have to be part of our discussion. Is like, okay, we can recognize all of those things going forward, and like Roman should be held to account for all the things that he did or didn't do. But can we separate the art he created that was
hmm,
independent of that? Like
yeah. I mean,
maybe
it's
it's a
like,
discussion to be had. Like
yeah.
I think I fall just briefly like on the line of we can,
Hmm.
um, but I recognize that that's hard. I find myself having a hard time watching some Kevin Spacey movies. I find
Hmm.
myself a hard time laughing the way that I did at some Woody Allen stuff. Like
Yeah.
it becomes more difficult. As much as I'd like to be the guy who can separate that, it does come across. It's part of it now. It's part of
Yeah.
the fabric,
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, we
because I
talked
love
about
the
that
movie. Yeah,
some when we talked about Annie Hall, right?
yeah, yeah,
And I
we did.
think our kind of preface, I think when we had that discussion was partly just to say there's no right or wrong answer as far as being able to separate the art from the artist or not. You know, if someone just feels like I just can't enjoy a Woody Allen movie anymore, knowing what I know, it's like, well, you know what? That's totally fair.
Yeah,
Nothing wrong with that.
I'm not gonna start like
Hmm.
going after you on Twitter because you feel that way. I'm gonna recognize that that is a totally acceptable
Hmm.
point of view.
Yeah.
Um,
Now, of course, when you have Scarlett Johansson out there saying, well, no, I believe him. I think he's telling the truth. He didn't do any of it. He's totally innocent. And it's like, all right.
you know, I feel like that's a critical error on her point, and because now all of a sudden people who do associate those things together
Yeah.
are going to put her into the same conversation, whereas they maybe wouldn't. I mean, yeah, she was in Wimbledon or whatever, and that was the one she was in, right?
Vicky Cristina Barcelona, I think. Right? She may have been also in Wimbledon.
I thought she was the American girl in Wimbledon. That was the kind of the
Sounds like you're saying Wimbledon, like with a
Wimbledon.
T. Anyway, I think we're kind of off track. But the
Anyway,
point,
we're off
yeah.
track. Yeah,
But
let's.
yeah, so we're not here tonight to talk about uh, Scarlett Johansson.
Nope.
But next
Chinatown.
time we're
We'll
going to
be good.
talk about Some Like It Hot and Chinatown, and we'll be back to do that when we get around to it, as
Sounds good.
is our standard. So we hope you guys enjoyed this discussion, and we'll let you know when we're ready to do the next one. And in the meantime, watch good movies, everyone.
Yay.